All right. Uh, Time is 3 p.m. on your part of the world. It's 9 p.m. on my part of the world. Welcome, everybody, to the inaugural session of the Martin Sherwin Fellowship Lecture. It's a great pleasure to be here with all of you tonight and to see so many old friends and some new ones. I will briefly introduce the lecturer and the speaker, then I will give him the floor, then I will pass the floor to our commentator, and then she will talk for another minutes, and then in the remaining 20 minutes, we'll open questions and answer from the audience. So it's a great honor and a pleasure to be here and open up the inaugural session of the Martin Sherwin Fellowship Lecture, which is a wonderful way to remember a dear friend and mentor to all of us. The purpose of the fellowship is to support emerging scholars in the fields of nuclear policy and history research. Competitively selected junior researchers will receive a 3 to 6 months residential fellowship to conduct independent research at the Wilson Center and in the Washington, D.C. area. Fellows receive office space at the Wilson Center, have access to the Library of Congress holdings, and present their work in a public forum during their fellowship tenure. Eligible scholars may come from all disciplines though a historical approach is required. Marty would not approve of anything different, I think. The fellowship is administered by the Wilson Center's History and Public Policy Program in partnership with the Sherwin family and in consultation with an advisory board composed of senior scholars in the field. Let me add a few words about Marty, even though most of us had the pleasure and the honor of knowing him. Marty Sherwin was a preeminent scholar in the field of nuclear history and was deeply concerned about the dangers of the nuclear age. His research and publications were widely recognized. As you probably all know, his major biography of J. Robert Oppenheimer, American Prometheus, which he co-authored with Kai Bird, received a Pulitzer Prize in 2006 and became the basis for a major film by Christopher Nolan. Marty, as he was lovingly called by his students and colleagues, had his greatest satisfaction from his active engagement with his students. He was a fellowship recipient at the Wilson Center for 3 times and worked on his final book at the Wilson Center. And his final book, as you all know, is the definitive work on the Cuban Missile Crisis titled Gambling with Armageddon. While in residence, he developed enduring connections to the Wilson Center History and Public Policy Program and to the Nuclear Proliferation International History Project, which I co-direct with my longtime friend, Christian Osterman. Marty was a senior advisor and lead instructor at the Nuclear History Bootcamp, which both of our hosts tonight attended a few years ago. Both of our guests, sorry. And while there, he helped to shape this major project, becoming a mentor at large to dozens of PhD students from around the world. The fellowship was established by the Wilson Center and the Sherwin family to honor Marty's memory and accomplishments. The fellowship fund has been generously supported by dozens of Marty's family members, friends, colleagues, and former students, as well as by several philanthropic foundations. The fund will help to support the next generation of scholars working on issues that were of personal and professional interest to Marty. Pete, would you mind sharing a link to the Sherwin Fellowship webpage? There it is, so you can all see it. And now let's get down to work with our first lecture of our series, and it's Negotiated Inequalities, Latin America and the Making of the Nuclear Club by J. Luis Rodriguez. Luis is an assistant professor of international security and law at George Mason University's Schar School for Policy and Government. His research analyzes how developing countries design nuclear non-proliferation and disarmament mechanisms, norms of humanitarian intervention, and regulations on emerging technologies with security applications. Dr. Rodriguez is an affiliate of Stanford University's Center for International Security and Cooperation, where he was a Stanton Nuclear Security postdoctoral fellow and a Social Sciences postdoctoral fellow. He was also, let me stress that once again, a boot camper in 2019. He holds a PhD and an MA in political science from Johns Hopkins University and a BA in international relations from El Colegio de Mexico. Luis, you have about 20 to 25 minutes to talk to us about Latin America and the making of the nuclear club, negotiated inequalities. Floor is all yours.
Thanks for the introduction, Polo. And I want to start by thanking the Wilson Center, the History and Public Policy Program, the Nuclear Proliferation International History Project, and especially the Martin J. Sherwin Fellowship for supporting my research, and also for the opportunity to present this project. Marty Sherwin's work has influenced my thinking and my research, and I'm incredibly honored to be the first person to hold this fellowship, which has provided me with the space, the time, but also the support to explore Latin America's contribution to building the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And I want to start today by bringing us back to the summer of 2022, 2 years ago, when after an almost 2-year delay caused by COVID, diplomats gathered in the UN headquarters in New York for the review conference of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, the NPT. And before this happened, observers were very worried about tensions that could emerge between nuclear disarmament proponents and skeptics, and how this could challenge the review process. And developing countries were especially vocal in criticizing nuclear powers for backtracking on their promises to reduce their nuclear arsenals. Developing countries argued that the NPT is supposed to rest on 3 pillars equally, but nuclear powers have emphasized the non-proliferation pillar over the development and the disarmament ones. And developing countries' attention to development and disarmament is not new. It can be traced back to the drafting of the NPT. And recent scholarship on the origins of the nuclear order investigates why and how NPT negotiators created this treaty that allegedly rests on these 3 pillars. And authors argue that instead of a grand bargain balancing these 3 goals for all states equally, the NPT created what William Walker calls a managed system of deterrence for NPT members with nuclear arsenals and a managed system of abstinence for everyone else. And scholars focus on how the NPT held powerful countries, especially those with nuclear arsenals, create a nuclear club that asks weaker states, especially developing countries, to grant privileges to great powers so that nuclear powers could bear the costs of providing security in a war with nuclear weapons. However, I think that there is less attention to why developing countries accepted unequal institutions during the design phase. If the NPT held nuclear powers impose an unequal global nuclear order, why did some developing countries accept this unequal compromise while others did not? That is the main research that is driving this research project. And international relations literature offers 2 potential, but I think incomplete explanations for the nuclear interests and the NPT participation of developing countries. Interest-based explanations would argue that powerful states usually dominate processes of institutional design, and developing countries accept unequal security treaties when these treaties make them better off than having no deal at all to deal with security threats or challenges. So for these authors, developing states accepted the NPT because the treaty proposed to them reflected some of their interests, even if it was an unequal compromise. And it was potentially better for these countries to have a non-proliferation treaty, even if unequal, than having no instrument to deal with proliferation risks at all. In response, though, some scholars present a different explanation. And participation is the main driver of these explanations. these authors would argue that states accept unequal bargains when they can participate in designing these different security treaties. So governance inequalities are not impositions by great powers, because developing countries consider unequal institutions or unequal treaties fair if they can participate in designing these treaties. So these authors would argue that while developing countries did not have much influence during the original design of the NPT, they have had gradual influence over the NPT as time goes on. And different authors pay attention especially to the extension process of the NPT in 1995, or to the different strategies that these countries use to propose some of their adjustments through review conferences. So yes, developing countries in the committee designing the NPT accepted this treaty because at the end it reflected some of their interests. Still though, I argue that they did not passively wait for a treaty proposal to come to them to assess if this proposal protected their interests or not. And I think that paying attention to how these states participated in building the NPT would basically open up the negotiating black box and would help us uncover whether and how developing countries influence the NPT to better reflect their interests. And I will give you the bottom line up front. The main argument in my project is that the acceptance or the rejection of NPT inequalities depended on whether developing countries could modify the treaty proposals, especially modify them to, one, better reflect their interests, and I think more importantly, to tame disparities between countries with nuclear arsenals and countries without nuclear weapons. And this is important because the US used multilateralism to build nuclear governance, to build the NPT. In the regional phase, the US invited 5 countries from the North Atlantic Treaty Organization and 5 countries from the Warsaw Pact to start drafting a non-proliferation treaty. But after this group of 10 governments could not reach a consensus, US and Soviet leaders formed the 18-Nation Disarmament Committee in 1962, inviting neutral and non-aligned countries to the negotiating table. And the ENDC, the 18-Nation Disarmament Committee, negotiated the NPT from 1965 to 1968. And it's interesting to see why the US and the Soviet Union decided to include these countries. The US, for example, considered that these non-aligned and neutral countries, most of them, they're the allies of the US, would potentially accept the preferences of the US. And in contrast, the Soviet Union thought that it would have a favorable audience in these 8 new countries, but especially among developing countries by criticizing the projects of the West. However, contrary to US and Soviet expectations, developing states' acquiescence during the NPT negotiations was not automatic. These countries even rejected the initial NPT draft that the US and the Soviet representatives presented in coalition at the ENDC. And this rejection made nuclear powers understand that they needed developing countries' support if they wanted to amass a commanding majority in favor of the NPT when the treaty opened for signatures. And this was especially important when decolonization multiplied the number of developing countries in the United Nations. So for the NPT to be successful, weaker states, developing countries among them, needed to see this treaty as a compromise that they should respect, and not as a fig leaf for inequalities that they should disrupt. And in the ENDC, Brazil and Mexico were the only 2 Latin American states included. And these 2 countries saw nuclear technologies as a tool that they could use to promote development, and they also supported multilaterally designed and collectively enforced non-proliferation commitments. Despite these commonalities between Brazil and Mexico, though, when the NPT opened for signatures, Brazil denounced the treaty as discriminatory, and Mexico was among its most prominent supporters. So in my project, what I do is basically trying to understand the nuclear preferences of these countries and why they are so different, and then the nuclear strategies that they use to build the NPT. And in my project, I have a whole section analyzing the actors and the factors behind the Brazilian and Mexican nuclear interests. Being mindful of the time, though, let me just quickly summarize that section. Brazil and Mexico share an interest in promoting disarmament and non-proliferation, while securing at the same time developing countries' access to peaceful nuclear technologies. And despite these common goals, Brazil favored trying to guarantee its ability to develop peaceful nuclear explosions, while Mexico prioritized building nuclear regulations. So since the beginning, they had different primary goals in the process of building the NPT. And Brazilian leaders concluded that their latent nuclear abilities could help them promote domestic economic development. And in contrast, Mexican governments were worried that nuclear arms races between the Cold War superpowers would increase Mexico's international vulnerability. Especially, this is something that they realized after the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. So Brazilian and Mexican authorities sought nuclear governance mechanisms, and especially mechanisms that would respect their interests. And at the ENDC, the 18-Nation Disarmament Committee, the representatives from Mexico and Brazil asked for a treaty that would balance non-proliferation, disarmament, and access to peaceful nuclear technologies. But their emphases were different. And in the Q&A, I can go deeper into the actors and the factors behind this country's nuclear interests. For now, though, let me turn into how they translated these preferences into strategies during the construction of the NPT. And at the 18-Nation Disarmament Committee, Brazilian and Mexican authorities consider that the optimum nuclear order would promote total nuclear disarmament. In basically following the argument that if nuclear weapons are so dangerous, maybe we should disarm countries that have nuclear arsenals. And Brazil and Mexico stated this goal from the initial to the last rounds of the NPT negotiations. But they realized, especially the Mexican diplomats, that it would be challenging to accomplish this goal. So instead, both Mexico and Brazil asked for a version of the NPT that would potentially offer a more balanced distribution of rights and duties between nuclear-armed states and states without nuclear arsenals. They were basically trying to reduce the inequalities that the NPT could or would institutionalize. And Brazilian and Mexican representatives went to the 18-Nation Disarmament Committee with the lessons they learned as participants or orchestrators of a regional treaty promoting non-proliferation and denuclearization in Latin America through a nuclear weapon-free zone. And Mexico led and Brazil actively participated in the negotiations of the Treaty for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons in Latin America and the Caribbean, commonly known as the Treaty of Tlatelolco. And these negotiations took place between March 1965 and February 1967. So they were happening in parallel with the negotiations of the 18 Nations Disarmament Committee. And the Treaty of Tlatelolco reinforced the US nuclear weapon monopoly in the Western Hemisphere. But it also limited the threat and use of nuclear force, guaranteed the exchange of nuclear technology from nuclear powers to Latin American countries, and according to Brazil, the Treaty of Tlatelolco also potentially created loopholes around peaceful nuclear explosions. So, while the Treaty of Tlatelolco institutionalized inequalities, it also addressed Latin American nuclear interests. And Brazil and Mexico wanted to expand or extrapolate the Latin American compromise to the NPT. They saw lessons that could be learned from this regional experience that they think they could be used in the international level, not only in the regional one. And in my project, I plan to reconstruct the negotiations of the NPT more comprehensively, but the main takeaways are that after several rounds of negotiations, the final text of the NPT included some points reflecting the Brazilian and the Mexican nuclear interests. So I would argue that both Brazil and Mexico were able to modify the text of the NPT to better reflect their nuclear preferences and their nuclear interests. In the Brazilian case, for example, the introductory section of the NPT establishes that nuclear powers should refrain from threatening or using nuclear force. Article 4 of the NPT states that nuclear powers should share nuclear knowledge with non-nuclear countries for non-military purposes, especially when these technologies could be used to promote development. But Brazilian diplomats fail to safeguard developing countries' ability to carry out peaceful nuclear explosions. And the Brazilian diplomats argue that this failure would institutionalize a, quote, status of dependence, end quote, for developing countries, creating even what they call a nuclear apartheid. So the Brazilian delegation argued that the NPT represented an unfair compromise, especially unfair to developing countries. And the Brazilian delegation announced that their country would not sign the NPT when it opened for signatures in 1968. Now, Brazil acceded to the NPT until 1998. But even then, Brazilian authorities asserted that the treaty formed what they call a nuclear cartel. And they argued that this cartel discriminated against developing countries. Brazil has not signed an additional protocol with the International Atomic Energy Agency, arguing that they already have a safeguards architecture with Argentina, a bilateral organization between Brazil and Argentina, and also an architecture that has 4 different parties, including the IAEA. So Brazil argues that asking states without nuclear arsenals to have an additional protocol with the IAEA is discriminatory, because for them, this would ask these countries to accept more commitments while nuclear powers do not adequately fulfill the disarmament pledges that they already adopted with the NPT back in the 60s. So that's the Brazilian case. Let me now move to the Mexican case. Mexican diplomats, I argue, were necessary to disentangle some very difficult deadlocks in the NPT negotiations that could have potentially disrupted the NPT process. Non-proliferation, for example, monopolized the attention of nuclear powers during these negotiations. And some states with no-nuclear arsenals in the 18-nation disarmament committee pushed for more ambitious disarmament goals. Some Mexican diplomats even described this ambition to get disarmament goal completely as an extreme thesis by basically saying that we needed complete disarmament or otherwise a non-proliferation treaty would not work. And this tension between non-proliferation and disarmament stalemated the negotiations at several points during the process of negotiating the NPT. And here, the Mexican representative Jorge Castañeda proposed to move disarmament commitments from the preamble of the NPT text into the operative text of the draft of this treaty. And this pledge would eventually become Article 6 in the final NPT text. Now, the Mexican delegation also asked to include elements in the drafts of the NPT, making the threat of the use of nuclear weapons as unlawful as the actual use of nuclear force. And after a lot of different negotiations and back and forth, they welcomed the fact that the final paragraph of the NPT introductory section included their requests. So they failed in getting negative security assurances into the treaty of the text, but at least there is kind of a political commitment there in the introductory section, according to the Mexican interpretation. And because of this, the Mexican delegation argued that this amendment, the inclusion of this point, was necessary if nuclear powers wanted to secure the support of developing countries. And the Mexican delegation kept using that argument in a lot of the different elements that they wanted to include in the NPT by basically saying that if these elements were not included in the text, developing countries would not support it. Now, the Mexican urgency for having a treaty to control proliferation risks did not mean that Mexican negotiators sidelined other interests, especially when it came to development. Mexican diplomats asked to include language in the NPT permitting the peaceful use of nuclear energy for development purposes. And they welcomed nuclear power's commitment to sharing non-military nuclear knowledge with countries that had no nuclear weapons in what would become Article 4 of the NPT. And because of all of these different factors, in June 1968, during the vote on the NPT final draft, Ambassador Alfonso Garcia Robles presented the position of the Latin American group and basically argued or explained that as a group, Latin America supported the NPT treaty because it reflected a compromise between nuclear powers and countries that had no nuclear weapons that, according to the Mexican and the Latin American countries that agreed with Mexico, guaranteed international security while promoting development. So for them, the NPT created this balance that they were seeking and asking during the different negotiation rounds of the NPT. So to recap then, Brazil participated in the NPT lawmaking process, but concluded that the NPT did not reflect a lot of the elements that they wanted. So Brazil could not modify the treaty to protect its interests. And Brazilian authorities were worried about the NPT institutionalizing a potential division between nuclear haves and nuclear have-nots. And they were especially cautious about accepting limits on their ability to conduct peaceful nuclear explosions. So, because of this, Brazilian authorities rejected the NPT in the 1960s because they could not modify the treaty to protect one of their main interests, accessing peaceful nuclear explosions. In contrast, Mexico saw the NPT as necessary to prevent nuclear problems. So even if the treaty was discriminatory, in the Mexican assessment, it was a necessary tool to address nuclear risks. The original drafts of the NPT did not reflect some fundamental Mexican interests, but Mexican representatives were able to modify treaty proposals to protect their preferences. And as a result, Mexican authorities joined the NPT not because they thought that the treaty provided equal rights, but because Mexican negotiators modified treaty drafts and got some of their compromise language accepted by nuclear powers. So, during the NPT negotiations, the Latin American concessions and compromises, I would argue, were strategic decisions that helped these countries promote their nuclear interests and governance preferences. These countries facilitated the creation of a non-proliferation treaty that has helped to manage nuclear risks since then. And while Brazil and Mexico managed to tame some NPT inequalities by securing prerogatives for developing countries and also by getting concessions from nuclear powers, they kind of participated in hierarchy building from below by making this treaty more acceptable for other weaker states. But this is also why today Brazil and Mexico are some of the leading countries in the charge to ban nuclear weapons, asking nuclear powers to basically live up to their disarmament commitments. And that is also why during the different review processes of the NPT, we keep seeing these different three pillars getting in conflict with each other. And I think that this tension between how to live up to the commitments that these countries were able to get back in the 60s will keep permeating the NPT process from years to come. And with that, I'm very grateful again with the Martin J. Sherwin Fellowship for the opportunity to do this research and to present my work today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Luis. This has been very, very interesting and exciting. And it's now my pleasure to introduce to the audience our next speaker, Professor Jaita Sarkar, an old friend and a former boot camper from 2012. Professor Sarkar is Professor of Global History of Inequalities at the University of Glasgow. Her research and teaching areas are global and transnational histories of decolonization, capitalism, nuclear infrastructures, and South Asia. Her first book, Plowshares and Swords, India's Nuclear Program in the Global Cold War, published by Cornell University Press in 2022, received honorable mention for the 2023 Best Book Award from the International Studies Association's Global Development Studies section. She's currently writing two books, Atomic Capitalism, A Global History, under contract with Princeton University Press, America and the World Series, and Connected Partitions from South Asia to the World. She's a fellow of the Royal Historical Society and serves on the board of directors for Arms Control Association in Washington, D.C. Jay, it's a pleasure to have you with us. You have about 10 minutes, maybe a little less, a little more, up to you. And then we'll open up the floor to Q&A. Floor is yours.
So it is my immense pleasure to join the inaugural Marty J. Sherwin Lecture to celebrate Marty's legacy, who many of us, all of us, have known on this panel as a scholar, educator, and mentor. And I had the good fortune, as Poldo was saying, to know him through NPIHP and the summer school, the Nuclear History Bootcamp that Both Luis and I attended. So it is really an honor to serve on the fellowship committee to maintain his legacy and to act as a discussant on the panel to celebrate Luis Rodriguez, a colleague and a neighbor this year in DC as our first Sherman Fellow of 2024. So I was delighted to read Luis's very interesting and important paper, a negotiated inequality, which presents a novel argument about the asymmetries in the global order. And through the negotiations leading to the NPT and the Treaty of Tlatelolco, Luis juxtaposes Mexico and Brazil to show how the two countries responded differently during what he calls the design phase of these treaties, right? And how they responded differently towards the inequalities integrated in the system itself, right? Brazil opposed, Mexico accepted. And thereby, I find that Luis's work really challenges this conventional wisdom by presenting heterogeneous understanding of weaker countries' behavior towards an unequal system. Like, why do countries that have less power, relatively speaking, respond differently to asymmetry? So instead of summarizing, his arguments and key takeaways, which I think he did himself very, very, very eloquently, very elegantly, I'm just going to ask 3 questions, and then we can open the floor for the Q&A. And we have a really good number in terms of attendees. I see a lot of, old friends and colleagues. So I think we'll all benefit from hearing from them more. So my first question, Luis, is that you show quite palpably that Brazil and Mexico had different priorities, right? Different capacities in terms of nuclear technologies and even raw materials, right? You do talk about how Mexico decided against nuclear energy and went towards oil. That's not really a choice that Brazil made. And Brazil obviously has, one of the largest producers of uranium and also thorium back in the day when people thought uranium was not that abundant in nature. But I find in the paper that you discard the influence of these elements that you do discuss. Like, for some reason, they don't really affect your argument of negotiated inequality. So when one pays close attention, when one pays close attention, it seems that it's not that surprising that the two countries acted so differently toward the NPT, and especially on the point of peaceful nuclear explosions. Like, that's what Brazil was so stuck upon, and Mexico was not. So when you think about, alternative explanations, one can easily argue that Brazil prioritized its agency in the nascent, what was then nascent global nuclear order, and its self-perception of a significant country with relatively sophisticated technical expertise, access to raw materials relevant to nuclear fission. Not the case with Mexico. So it's not like you show lack of awareness. you do discuss them in the paper, but you somehow they're not important. So I wonder why. And so perhaps you could comment a little bit about, the aspect of capacity, agency, and self-perception of countries that lead them to act differently at treaty negotiations and towards treaty outcomes. And related to this point, I find reading the paper that Mexico seems to prioritize process over outcome. It just seems like they're just delighted to be part of the treaty negotiations, that the fact that they are there, they're able to make some modifications and they're thrilled, which is great. But that doesn't affect their perception of the outcome, which is really important for Brazil. And perhaps that's a way to square the circle, that capacity, agency, self-perception affecting Brazil and they're prioritizing outcome, and Mexico is quite happy with the process itself, that they're there. So that's the first question. The second is, I really like, as I said at the beginning of my comment, I really like this expanding our horizon and just like of scholars, and telling us that it's a very complicated, heterogeneous world, right? The different countries approach treaties differently, even when they're at the receiving end of those treaties, right? But I find, and I see that your emphasis is Latin America, and for good reasons, right? There is a lot we can still find and learn about that part of the world. But at the same time, I find that heterogeneity from a regional perspective is interesting and new if the prior assumption is homogeneity, right? If you expect that a certain region will act in a certain way, and then we don't, and then they don't, and we're like, oh, that's interesting, that's new, right? So I wonder if it might be better served, as in your project, serve us intellectually better if you think about cross-regional comparisons, right? And I was looking at the list of ENDC, and I was wondering that Brazil and India has been compared, for the end of civilization. So perhaps, so I would not say why don't you compare with India, like given the fact that my introduction had India in my first book title. But perhaps it could be better served to compare, Burma and Mexico, right? Nobody questions why Burma, that at the time a non-aligned country, part of the ENDC, had a different approach to the NPT as opposed to India. Right. So perhaps, and then Ethiopia, Nigeria, like two other countries that you could probably, have little regional dyads and then compare the different regional dyads across and see what they were doing differently. And then give us as in, not just us servant folks, the fellowship folks, but just, the community of scholars you're talking to about what negotiated inequality can mean in a more capacious way, right? And the third and final point, and I said I'll keep my comments quite short, is that I think this is a really important project about negotiated inequality. And I'd like to know more about how generalizable this synthetic theory is, and you intend it to be. Can we think about applying this to non-nuclear treaties that are unequal in nature? And there are just so many of that, because that's the world we live in. So in terms of this point about generalizability, not just the NPT, but other treaties, not just nuclear, but the non-nuclear world, what are some of the next steps you are thinking in terms of, increasing the number of N, to use social scientific term, not my part of the world, as you know, but, some of my best friends are political scientists. So what are you thinking about increasing the number of observations so you can create a theory that has broader applicability? And one last point, bringing the conversation back to the region of Latin America. There's a really excellent book coming out next year with UNC Press, Interconnections book series by Renata Keller. It is on hemispheric insecurity, if you will, with respect to the Cuban Missile Crisis. That might give you a lot of historical evidence to draw from for developing this theory further. Once again, Luis, thanks for sharing your work, and I look forward to your responses.
Thank you so much, Jay, for raising some very interesting points. I will now give Luis a chance to respond while we collect questions from the audience. Let me remind you how to pose your questions. You can either write your questions in the chat or raise your hands. And by raising your hand, you will immediately rise to the top of the audience list, and that will allow me to identify you and give you the floor. So, Luis, while we start collecting questions, you have a few minutes to reply to Jay's points.
Perfect. Thank you, Paulo. And Jay, these are fantastic comments as always, and they're going to be very helpful as I think about expanding the project, especially because I think that there are a lot of blind spots in what I have right now. And man, I would love to go to all of the archives that I could go to and find more information to basically pay attention to those blind spots. So let me take the questions as you pose them. The first one about maybe the capacity, the agency, and the self-perception of these countries influence what they emphasize, with Mexico emphasizing process and Brazil emphasizing outcomes. And I think that is very interesting. And a lot of international relations scholars paying attention to status would gravitate toward that alternative explanation, especially because there is this idea that Brazil in the 60s was a rising power, was a regional power, and especially because they had all of these different material and technological capabilities. So, of course, they were not going to accept a treaty that would limit their rising ambitions. And the NPT would have done that, especially because back in the 60s, the scientific and technological consensus is that maybe PNEs, peaceful nuclear explosions, were a thing. So it's not like Brazil was going against the consensus. I mean, Atoms for Peace, the Eisenhower administration, that is what they were saying. So of course they were not going to accept limitations on what they could do to rise. The interesting thing here, and I'm not saying this just because I'm Mexican and I might be biased because of that, but Mexico was also seen as a rising power back in the 60s. It had, even if we consider a rising power by the number of times that Time magazines puts a country in the cover, Mexico had a cover. And Mexico also was seen as this Latin American country that could be at the forefront of all of these different third world countries by basically creating a fourth alternative, even because they were not part of any of the wars, they were not part of the Alliance movement, but they were trying to do their own thing. So Mexico also had those status aspirations. The fascinating thing here for me, and I am not a historian by training, so I'm going to do the sin that historians are told not to do, but in counterfactual exercises, I don't know if Mexico would have signed the NPT if it hadn't gotten a lot of the things that they asked for during the negotiating process. So I don't think that they were just there for the sake of participating in the process. They were actually there to get a lot of the different commitments that they wanted to get. They were very active in Tlatelolco, and it was a similar process there where they faced a lot of the same debates that were happening at the ENDC. And they also favor outcomes over process in Tlatelolco. So while I go back to the archives and I check all of these different materials again, I will be paying attention to those elements that you were telling me. But I think that Mexico was not just paying attention to process, as I also think that Brazil was not only paying attention to outcomes, because the Brazilians were also very actively promoting a lot of the different interests in the negotiation process. The counterfactual here would be that maybe if the NPT said PNEs are okay, Brazil would have signed it. For the second question, I think that it would be also fascinating to go to the archives of the 8 neutral and non-aligned countries that were included in the ENDC, especially because they were able to create a lot of different common fronts and alliances, even if you think of an alliance in the negotiating aspect, during the discussions creating the NPT. So I think that I will be able to find how they created those different negotiating fronts, and that would be fascinating. Now, I also think, because you mentioned Renata Keller's book, that it would be very interesting to not only go to the archives of Mexico and Brazil again, but maybe see if I can go to the archives of different Latin American countries, especially the ones that were not part of the ENDC, and pay attention to why they accepted this. Yeah, Mexico was negotiating for a lot of the different interests and preferences of these countries by proxy. Alfonso Garcia Robles or different members of the Mexican diplomatic team would say that they were representing Latin America, but it will be interesting to see if the Latin American countries actually saw themselves as represented by Mexico, or how they participated in this process of telling Mexico what to include in the negotiating process. And once I see those aspects, both how Mexico and Brazil created those negotiating alliances with the other countries that were neutral and non-aligned, but also how they created alliances in Latin America, I think that would help me answer the how generalizable is this theory question. For now, I don't have an answer. I'm in the happy phase of looking at my archives, looking at my sources, and seeing what I find. But I think there are echoes here of strategies that other countries, either the other 6 neutral non-aligned countries were doing, or other Latin American developing countries, even in other regions, were trying to do as they were seeing these negotiations unfold.
Fabulous. Well, it's a happy state to be in. I hope you maintain the delight and don't, have my questions puncture your happiness. But it's a great project. Thanks again for sharing with us.
Thank you both, Luis and Joita. We have a first question by Dinsho Mystery. Do you want to ask the question yourself? Should I read it for you? Okay, then I'm happy to read it. Dinsho, to what extent or in what one or two main ways did the negotiations and eventual treaty influence the position of Mexico and Brazil during the NPT negotiations? To phrase it differently, as a counterfactual, if there were no regional negotiations on the Tlatelolco Treaty, what one or two main issues would change about Mexico's and Brazil's negotiation stance on the NPT? Luis, I have also another question. Would you like me to read it, or would you prefer to answer this first question and then I'll read the next one?
Maybe let me take this one, Poldo, because I
Okay,
think the
sure.
answer is going to be a
Your
little bit.
call.
Dinsho, the question is a question that I myself have in this project, and I think that if I were to expand, I don't know if this is going to be a paper, a book manuscript. If I were to expand this into a book project, I think I would love to see what were Mexico and Brazil learning from the Tlatelolco negotiations and what were they trying to extrapolate into the NPT discussions. I think that Mexico, for example, was able to get negative security assurances from all nuclear powers. It took them a little bit longer to get the Chinese to sign into these different protocols, but Mexico was very active in that charge in trying to get negative security assurances. And I think that because of that, the Mexican negotiators learned how to negotiate with nuclear powers. They were able to see what worked, what didn't, how to phrase stuff, how to approach these different countries. In the Brazilian sense, I think that Brazil also, they would argue, Mexico actually later would argue against, but Brazil learned how to get ambiguous language around peaceful nuclear explosions included in the Treaty of Tlatelolco. And even during the NPT negotiations, Brazil kept saying, Tlatelolco is much better. Tlatelolco is superior to this drafts that you're presenting to me because it, secretly, but kind of implicitly, because it allows us to have peaceful nuclear explosions. At one moment, they say that explicitly, and the Mexicans protest. And Mexican diplomats basically say, like, no, no, no. The Treaty of Tlatelolco actually prohibits peaceful nuclear explosions if you read the text carefully. And Brazil counters the counter by saying, like, this is Mexico trying to get influence at the ENDC. That is a revisionist interpretation of the Treaty of Tlatelolco. So Brazil learns how to get that ambiguous language into these different treaties. And these countries also learn how to create coalitions. Mexico learns how to mobilize the interests and preferences of other developing countries during the Treaty of Tlatelolco by trying to sideline what Argentina and Brazil were saying. And Brazil on its own also learns how to create these different alliances with other countries that might also want to guarantee their access to things like peaceful nuclear explosions. So they are learning how to negotiate. So it will be very interesting, then again, to see what are these countries learning from the regional scenario and taking with them to the international scenario.
Thank you, Luis. I have the next question from Dr. Megan Isley Walsh. Should I read your question? Do you want to pose it yourself? Okay, then I'll go ahead and read it. Very interesting. Thank you. Based on your comments, it seems as if geography is a chief concern in why the countries decided as they did. If Mexico and Brazil were reversed in their locations, do you think they would have come to different conclusions than they did? Yet another counterfactual for you, Luis. Would you like to answer that?
Yeah. Thank you, Megan. And I think that this is a question that also aligns a lot with Renata Keller's new book about how Latin American countries had different experiences even when it came to the Cuban Missile Crisis and how they reacted differently depending on how they assess, not only government elites, but also publics, how they assess their vulnerability in a nuclear world. Here, in one of the sections in the paper that I circulated to Jay, I have this whole section of how Mexican authorities saw themselves as sharing a border with the nuclear world. Not only because the US was testing a lot of these different nuclear devices close to the border or depositing nuclear waste close to the border, but also because of the Cuban Missile Crisis. And then again, they're not only because they were neighbors of the country that would potentially be hit with Soviet nuclear weapons, but also because Soviet strategists plan to bomb Mexican cities. In this whole idea that if we are, as the Soviet Union, in a war with the US would potentially get supplies or help through the southern border. So let's avoid that scenario. So Mexican authorities knew that they were vulnerable. At some point, even the US administration share a lot of these different intelligence that they gather with the Mexican government, potentially also to let them know that in a potential nuclear confrontation, it was not the US alone. Mexico would also be collateral damage here. The Brazilians had a different perception. And Renata Keller is very good at finding all the evidence about how, for Brazil at the beginning, yes, the Cuban Missile Crisis was a wake-up call about the risks in the nuclear age. But then they learned quickly that they were not at the same risk level as the Mexicans. And that changed a little bit of the perceptions and also a little bit of the interests and preferences that they had when it came to governing the atom and preventing nuclear risks. So in the paper, I have a little bit of that, of how geopolitics influences the different nuclear preferences of these countries. But I also think that geography is not destiny. And by negotiating Tlatelolco, by participating in the NPT, what the Mexicans were trying to do was basically shape that destiny and not only have it as a geographical predestination of what they would do or what they would say. It's a very good comment, though. So this is one of the comments that I will take with me when I go back into my resources to pay attention to this issues and how they affect the NPT.
Thank you, Luis. I don't see any hands raised or any questions written in the Q&A section, or maybe, yes, there is one that just arrived. Mark M. This is a great topic, as the NPT has affected the world differently. My question is based on the economic pros and cons in accepting the NPT. Were the negotiation strategies able to be linked to other economic strategies? Luis.
Yeah, this is also one of the aspects that I try to pay attention when it comes to why do these countries have different interests and how economic factors influence the kind of goals that they had when they came into the negotiation rooms. So in the Mexican case, the economic assessment was that, yes, we need access to peaceful nuclear technologies, but developing these technologies is not going to be as economically profitable as keep relying on other energy sources, for example, like oil. And in the Brazilian way of thinking, they fully bought into the whole idea that peaceful nuclear explosions were possible and that they were what they needed to develop a lot of infrastructure projects at a cheaper cost and at a faster rate. Now, also the NPT, according to some scholars, and I was able to find a little bit of evidence in the archives, especially at the Lyndon B. Johnson Library, did not create kind of a conditional requirement in terms of the transfer of peaceful nuclear technology only to countries that signed the NPT. So even at some point, when Brazil was thinking whether they were going to sign the NPT or not, they talk with their US counterparts, and the US was very ambiguous about whether they were going to stop a lot of technology cooperation with Brazil if Brazil didn't sign the NPT. And Brazil fully took advantage of that ambiguity to not sign the NPT and still trying to get a lot of different access to these different technologies. So in that way, the assessment there was also influenced by what kind of access they could have to these different tools that they thought were necessary and useful to promote, then again, development at a faster rate and at a cheaper cost.
Thank you, Luis. We're running out of time and we're approaching the end of our session, but there is time maybe for one more question, if anybody from the audience wants to ask it. Don't see anybody doing that. Then, Luis, I have just a very quick comment myself, if I can take advantage of my position. I was very interested in what you said about Mexico arguing that it was thanks to their effort that the disarmament pledge was moved from the introduction to the treaty to Article 6. And it's interesting to see how many countries thought they were basically responsible for the same thing. I'm not saying that Mexico wasn't, but the Italians thought they did it. My work on the in the Italian archives points in the same direction, and I wonder how many countries thought the same. So it would be interesting to have a comparative approach and analysis of which countries thought they were responsible for doing what in the negotiations. I think it would be a great project, but also a very demanding one, because you would have to look at quite a number of archives. But I wonder what you think of that.
Yeah, no, this is absolutely true, Poldo. And the Mexican sources, they keep quoting and showing all the letters that they're getting from both the US and the Soviet Union saying, yes, you were responsible for this. Yes, thanks to you, we got there's many more signatories. But I'm sure that the US and the Soviet Union were sending those letters to not just the Mexicans, but like potentially all the other members in the ENDC to say, like, yeah, thank you for your support. You are the one that was responsible for all of these different aspects. The good thing, though, is that I have some documents from the LBJ library where they point out that it was not Mexico on its own, but there was like this coalition that was getting formed, pushing the nuclear powers to get some of these different aspects. The interesting thing there, and it would be great if I could go to Italy and to the archives and see what the Italians are saying. The interesting thing there would be how
probably taking a lot of credit for things they didn't do. And if I sum it up briefly.
Yeah, no, but it would be interesting to see how those coalitions were formed. I mean, who was leading these different coalitions, or what themes was each of the different delegations in the ENDC being responsible to push for, and how were they creating these different commonalities in the strategies that they use to ask for these different aspects to be included in the NPT? Because I don't think that it was just one country responsible for this. I think it was much more of a coalition kind of dynamic happening during the negotiations.
Thank you so much, Luis. We have only 1 minute left, so I'm gonna wrap this up by thanking, first of all, the Wilson Center and the Sherwin family for honoring Marty's memory by creating the Wilson Center Fellowship. This inaugural lecture was fantastic, with a very interesting session. Thank you both, Luis Rodriguez and Jaita Sarkar, for a very interesting presentation and very stimulating comment. Thanks to everyone in the audience for staying with us for all this time. It's been a great pleasure and an honor to chair this session and honor Marty's memory, such a great friend and mentor for all of us. And I think this was the best way to remember him, by listening to a very thoughtful presentation and a very thoughtful set of comments from our distinguished guests. Thank you, everybody, and hope to see you soon. Ciao.